Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. We get a lot of great material from you listeners, and today we're diving into some seriously heavy stuff. We're tackling Saint Augustine.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
Augustine. He's a giant, isn't he? Huge impact on Western thought, philosophy, theology, you name it.
No kidding. And, it's all thanks to one of our listeners who sent in this fascinating excerpt from a book on Augustine. It's called, hang on a sec, 054 San Agustín, El Doctor de la Gracia contra el Mal.
Catchy title, huh?
Right. But let me tell you, the content is anything but light reading. This excerpt, just skimming through it, I can tell Augustine was wrestling with some really profound stuff. We're talking about the problem of evil, the nature of good and evil, all that good stuff.
Well, and let's not forget the historical context here. We're talking about a guy who lived through the fall of the Roman Empire. Imagine trying to make sense of good and evil while your world is literally crumbling around you.
Yeah, no kidding. It's 410 AD. The Visigoths have sacked Rome. It's like watching everything you know and believe in just fall apart.
Talk about a crisis of faith. And that's precisely what makes Augustine so fascinating. He was living through this period of immense upheaval, this clash between the old pagan world and the rising power of Christianity.
The book actually mentions this, that he saw the fall of Rome as symbolic of a clash between two cities, the earthly city and the heavenly city.
Right, and that image of the two cities becomes central to his whole worldview. But before we dive into that, I think it's important to understand that Augustine's own journey to faith was, well, a bit of a winding road, not exactly a straight line.
Oh, totally. I mean, he dabbled in all sorts of things before landing on Christianity. The excerpt talks about how he was into Manichaeism early on.
Manichaeism, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
It's this really dualistic religion, this idea of good and evil locked in this cosmic battle. For a while, it appealed to Augustine, this black and white view of the world, but eventually it just didn't satisfy him. He couldn't square that neat division with the complexities of human experience, with the reality of evil in a world created by a good God.
So then he stumbles upon Neoplatonism, which is a whole other philosophical system. I mean, talk about a 180.
Neoplatonism was a game changer for Augustine. It introduced him to this idea of a transcendent one, this source of all goodness and being. It's like there's this ultimate perfect source of everything good, and everything else emanates from that.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So you've got this backdrop of a collapsing empire, all this philosophical back and forth going on in Augustine's head, and then this fundamental question emerges. If God is all-powerful and good, how can evil even exist? I mean, that's a question we're still wrestling with today, right?
Exactly. And that question was the driving force behind so much of Augustine's work. It's the question that kept him up at night. And it led him to develop this mind-bending concept, evil as a privation of good.
Privation of good. Okay, break that down for me. I'm not a philosopher, so...
Yeah. Well, think of it like this. Augustine is saying that evil isn't a thing in itself. It's not like this dark force out there opposing God. Instead, it's the absence of something good. It's a lack, a void where goodness should be, like a shadow. A shadow isn't a thing itself. It's just the absence of light.
Okay, that's a helpful image. So evil's like a shadow, a darkness where there should be light. But then where does it come from? Is it our choices? Our free will?
Bingo. And that's where Augustine's ideas about free will and grace get really interesting. It's also where he starts to bump heads with other thinkers of his time.
Like the Pelagians. The book mentions them a couple of times.
The Pelagians. They were all about the power of the human will. That we could achieve salvation through our own efforts, through good deeds and moral living. Just be a good person and you'll be fine. But Augustine, after going through his own struggles with sin and having this dramatic conversion experience, he strongly disagreed. He felt like we're utterly dependent on God's grace for salvation. Like, we need help. Big time.
So are we talking about predestination here? That God has already chosen who will be saved and who won't?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's one that Augustine wrestled with for his entire life. This whole tension between free will and God's grace, it led him down some pretty controversial paths.
Okay, before we get too deep into predestination, I think we need to rewind a bit. We've got free will, but it's maybe a little broken.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to those two cities, right? The city of God and the city of man.
You got it. Augustine uses these cities to represent two different ways of living, two different orientations of the heart. The city of God is all about love for God, seeking spiritual truth, humility, all that jazz.
And the city of man, they're the party animals. All about worldly desires and chasing fleeting pleasures.
You could say that. They're driven by self-love, pride, and a desire for power and material possessions. They're focused on the here and now, on building their little empires down here.
I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. It's like this internal battle we all experience, right? Trying to balance our earthly desires with our spiritual aspirations.
And that tension, that struggle, is at the heart of so much of Augustine's work.
Okay, so we've got a collapsing empire, philosophical debates, a mind-bending view of evil, and this epic battle between two cities playing out within each of us. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we haven't touched on yet. Augustine's views on sexuality. And from what I skimmed in this excerpt, that's where things get even more, well, complicated.
Yeah, Augustine and sex. That's a conversation for another time.
Okay, so Augustine and sex. Where do we even begin with that?
Well, it's definitely a topic that's sparked a lot of debate over the centuries. Remember how we talked about his idea of evil as a privation of good? Well, he kind of applied that same logic to sexuality.
Wait, seriously, how does that even work?
Yeah. He believed that concupiscence, which is a fancy word for that intense, almost uncontrollable desire for things that aren't good for us, like that pull towards instant gratification, even when you know it might have consequences later on.
Well, he believed that was a consequence of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden.
Okay, so Adam and Eve, the forbidden fruit, all that. But how does that tie into sex?
Augustine took the story of Adam and Eve very literally. He believed their disobedience fundamentally altered human nature, and that concupiscence, this disordered desire, was part of that inheritance.
So this concupiscence, this lust, it's like a turning away from God, a corruption of what was originally good.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even trickier. Augustine believed this concupiscence was transmitted through sexual acts, even within marriage.
Oh, wow. So even within marriage, sex is somehow tainted by this original sin.
That was his view. And let's be real, it's a view that's been hotly debated and challenged throughout history, and it continues to be so today. I mean, it's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. No kidding. Yeah. It seems to cast a pretty negative light on something that's supposed to be about love and connection.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging aspect of Augustine's thought. It's important to remember the historical and cultural context he was writing in, but still, it raises some tough questions.
It does. So speaking of tough questions, the book also mentioned his clash with the Donatists. What was that all about?
The Donatists. They were a group of Christians in North Africa who were very, very strict about the purity of the church.
Purity. What does that even mean in this context?
Well, it all goes back to the persecutions that took place under Roman emperors like Decius and Diocletian. Brutal times for early Christians.
Right. Christians were being forced to renounce their faith or even hand over sacred texts just to survive. Talk about a rock and a hard place.
And that's where the rift began. The Donatists believed that anyone who caved under pressure, even if it was to save their own lives, had compromised their faith and couldn't be a part of the church anymore. They were especially concerned about clergy who had supposedly betrayed the church, arguing that any sacraments they performed after that weren't valid.
So no second chances. Once you're out, you're out.
Pretty much. It was a very rigid stance, and it caused a huge split in the Christian community in North Africa. You basically had two parallel churches, the Catholic Church and the Donatist Church.
Wow. So Augustine, with his own, let's say, colorful past, finds himself in the middle of this purity showdown. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is. Augustine definitely believed in God's grace and forgiveness, but he was also a firm believer in the institution of the church. He argued that the sacraments, like baptism, had an objective power, regardless of the person performing them.
So even if a priest wasn't exactly a saint, the act of baptism was still valid.
That was his position. He believed the church's holiness wasn't dependent on the actions of individual members, but on its connection to Christ and the truth of its teachings.
Okay, so the church is kind of like Teflon. Nothing sticks to it. Yeah. Doesn't that also make it untouchable? Like, no matter what its members do, it's always pure.
That's a criticism that's been leveled at the church throughout history, and it's definitely relevant here. But for Augustine, unity and authority were paramount. He was really concerned that allowing divisions and questioning the legitimacy of the church's sacraments would ultimately undermine its power to offer salvation.
So it's like prioritize the institution over individual accountability.
In a way, yes. And it's important to consider the political context here, too. Christianity was still fairly new as the official religion of the Roman Empire, and Augustine saw the Donatist schism as a threat to both the church and the empire's stability.
So double whammy. The church is under attack from within and without. So how does he handle this? Does he try to reason with the Donatists?
He definitely tried persuasion and theological debate, but it didn't stop there. He actually ended up supporting the use of imperial force to suppress the Donatists.
Wait, hold on. If Augustine's all about God's grace and love, how does that square with him advocating for violence against other Christians?
It's a complicated and frankly disturbing chapter in Augustine's story. He argued that compelling people to return to the church, even through coercion, was ultimately an act of love. He believed saving souls, even if it meant inflicting suffering in this life, was justified.
Oh, that's tough to hear. Is he saying it's okay to force people to believe what you believe, even if it means harming them?
Essentially, yes. And this idea, unfortunately, would have lasting consequences, being used to justify religious persecution and violence for centuries to come.
Wow. So much for love thy neighbor, huh?
It's definitely a dark side of Augustine's legacy. But remember, we were talking about his clash with the Pelagians, this debate about the very nature of human nature. That's where things get even more heated.
Right. The book dives into that whole Pelagian controversy, too. It seems like Augustine really went toe-to-toe with anyone who challenged his views.
He was definitely a force to be reckoned with. And the Pelagians, they really pushed his buttons.
Okay, so remind me, what exactly were they disagreeing about?
The Pelagians, led by this British monk named Pelagius, had a much more optimistic view of human nature than Augustine. They believed humans were capable of choosing good and achieving salvation through their own efforts.
So, no need for God's grace. We can do it all on our own.
Pretty much. Pelagius emphasized free will and the importance of following God's commandments. He wasn't a fan of all that talk about predestination and the irresistible power of grace.
I can see how that would rub Augustine the wrong way, especially given his own personal struggles and his emphasis on God's grace.
Exactly. Augustine, having wrestled with his own sinful past, felt Pelagius was downplaying the role of God's grace. He believed that we're utterly dependent on God's mercy and that our free will has been, kind of messed up by sin.
So it's like Augustine saying we're all stuck in a car with a broken steering wheel, and the Pelagians are saying just grab an oar and row.
Perfect analogy. And you can see why their views would clash so dramatically. They had fundamentally different understandings of what it meant to be human and how salvation worked.
Right, two completely different roadmaps to heaven.
Sure.
So how did this theological cage match play out?
Well, it got pretty intense. I mean, they argued about everything from the nature of salvation to the role of baptism to the fate of infants who died before being baptized.
Wait, they argued about babies? Seriously?
Augustine believed that even infants were tainted by original sin and needed baptism for salvation. The Pelagians saw that as, well, cruel and unjust, to say the least.
This all comes back to those big questions about the nature of good and evil, human responsibility, and the role of God in our lives, right?
Exactly. And those questions are still relevant today. We're still wrestling with them, trying to make sense of this whole messy human experience.
No kidding. So Augustine grappled with questions of sexuality, battled the Donatists over the purity of the church, and challenged the Pelagians on the very essence of human nature. It seems like everywhere he went, controversy followed.
He was definitely a lightning rod, no doubt about that. But there's one more piece we need to explore, one that might tie all of this together. Augustine's view of history, particularly his famous work, The City of God. I have a feeling those two cities we keep coming back to are going to make a grand appearance.
You think, okay, let's see how this all connects. Augustine history, the city of God. Hit me with it.
The City of God was Augustine's attempt to make sense of history, especially after the shock of Rome being sacked by the Visigoths. Remember how we talked about the impact that event had on the Roman world? It was a total upheaval. Like, everything they thought they knew about the world was shattered.
It was like the ultimate symbol of the empire's decline, and people were freaking out.
Exactly. And a lot of people, both pagan and Christian, were questioning the meaning of history and God's role, or lack thereof, in it all. Where was God in all this chaos?
So what did Augustine have to say about all this? Did he have any answers?
He did, and his answer was, well, pretty epic. He saw the sack of Rome as this cosmic clash between the city of God and the city of man playing out on the stage of history.
Okay, so he's not just talking about literal cities here, right?
Nope. He's using these cities as metaphors for two ways of living, two different orientations of the heart. The city of God represents those who are guided by love for God, humility, and a desire for spiritual truth.
And the city of man. They're the folks clinging to worldly power and chasing fleeting pleasures.
You got it. They're driven by self-love, ambition, pride, and that pull toward instant gratification, that concupiscence that Augustine believed was at the root of so much human suffering.
So Augustine's saying history isn't just this random series of events. It's this ongoing battle between these two forces, these two cities, each vying for dominance.
That's his take. And he believed this struggle was ultimately heading toward a final judgment, a separation of these two cities, with the city of God ultimately prevailing. It's a dramatic vision of history, full of conflict and ultimately hope.
Okay, so Augustine's got us thinking about these two cities battling it out throughout history. But how does all of this connect back to us, to the challenges we face in our own lives? We're not exactly facing down hordes of Visigoths these days, are we?
True, but the battles might have just shifted to different arenas. Maybe it's less about physical walls and more about the walls we build within ourselves, the choices we make every day, the desires we chase, the values we prioritize.
You're saying the battle between the city of God and the city of man is still raging, just on a more personal level.
Maybe. And that's a question worth pondering, isn't it? Which city are we building? Which direction are we heading in? What kind of world are we creating with our choices, our actions, our very way of being?
Heavy stuff. It's
Right.
definitely a lot to chew on, but that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Getting you to think, to question, to explore those deeper layers of meaning and purpose.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to leave you with one final thought. Given everything we've learned about Augustine, his struggles, his insights, even his mistakes, how do you think his ideas might be relevant to the challenges we face today? What can we learn from him, even centuries later?
That's a great question to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Saint Augustine. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. All right, so last time we were in the middle of this epic showdown between Augustine and the Pelagians, and let me tell you, it's about to get even more intense.
Oh, yeah. Augustine is not pulling any punches here. This is where he really doubles down on his concept of original sin.
That whole idea that we're all born with this, like, inherent flaw stemming from Adam and Eve's little snacking incident in the Garden of Eden.
Exactly. It's that idea that we inherit this tendency towards evil, this concupiscence, as he called it, that we just can't shake off on our own.
Yeah, concupiscence, that's a mouthful. But doesn't that seem a little unfair, like we're being punished for something we didn't even do?
Well, for Augustine, it wasn't about punishment or blame. It was more about recognizing our need for God's grace. He believed that original sin had, kind of messed up human nature, leaving us with this pull towards selfishness and instant gratification that we just can't overcome on our own willpower.
Okay, so I'm starting to see his point. But if we're all essentially predisposed to evil, thanks to Adam and Eve, do we really have free will? I mean, where does choice come into play?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Augustine tries to address that. He argued that, yeah, we do have free will, but it's been seriously weakened by original sin. It's like, think of it like a car with a busted steering wheel. You can try to steer, but you're not really in control.
So is God's grace like the mechanic who comes along and fixes the steering wheel?
That's a great way to put it. Augustine believed that God's grace is what enables us to truly choose good and to live in accordance with God's will. It's not something we earn or deserve. It's a gift.
Okay, so the Pelagians are all about pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you got this. And Augustine's like, nah, we need a tow truck. We need divine intervention.
Exactly. And that fundamental difference in perspective, it had huge implications for how they understood pretty much everything, from salvation to the role of the church to the very meaning of human existence.
I'm starting to see why this debate got so heated. These weren't just abstract theological ideas. They were about how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe.
Exactly. And these questions that Augustine and the Pelagians were wrestling with, they're still relevant today, aren't they? Like, how much control do we really have over our lives? What role does grace play? What does it even mean to be human in a world full of, well, good and evil?
Deep stuff, man. Deep stuff. And speaking of deep stuff, I'm really curious to hear more about Augustine's view of history, especially his famous work, The City of God. I mean, it seems like we keep coming back to these two cities, the City of God and City of Man. So what's the connection?
Well, the City of God was Augustine's attempt to make sense of history, especially after the whole Roman Empire thing went down. Remember, the sack of Rome by the Visigoths was a huge deal. It sent shockwaves through the entire world.
Yeah, people were freaking out. Like, is this the end of civilization as we know it?
Pretty much. And Augustine saw this event as, like, this epic clash between the City of God and the City of Man playing out on the world stage.
So he's not just talking about literal cities, right?
Yeah.
It's more symbolic.
Definitely. He's using these cities as metaphors for two ways of living, two different orientations of the heart. The City of God, it represents those who love God, who seek spiritual truth, who are humble and compassionate.
And the City of Man, they're more like the empire builders, the folks who are all about power and wealth and, well, maybe a little bit of hedonism.
You got it. They're driven by self-love, ambition, a desire for control, a desire for stuff. They're focused on the here and now, on building their kingdoms in this world.
So Augustine's saying that history isn't just this random series of events, it's this ongoing struggle between these two forces, these two cities, each trying to shape the world in their own image.
Exactly. And he believed the struggle was ultimately heading toward a final judgment, a separation of these two cities, with the city of God ultimately winning out. It's a pretty dramatic vision, full of conflict and hope. It's kind of inspiring in a way.
Yeah, I can see how that would have been comforting to people living in those uncertain times. It gives meaning to suffering and a sense of, like, cosmic purpose to it all.
And that's part of why Augustine's work has resonated with people for centuries. He grappled with these huge existential questions that we're still asking today. Questions about good and evil, about human nature, about the meaning of history. And he offered answers that have shaped Western thought in profound ways.
It's been a wild ride diving deep into the world of Saint Augustine. I mean, he's a complicated figure, no doubt about that. But his ideas, they've really made me think, you know. They've challenged me to look at the world and my place in it in a whole new way.
That's the power of great thinkers, isn't it? They make us uncomfortable, they push our buttons, they make us question our assumptions. And Augustine, he was a master of that. He may have been a man of his time, but his ideas, they transcend time. They speak to something deep within the human heart, this longing for meaning, for purpose, for connection with something greater than ourselves.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. To all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this journey. It's been real, folks. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you next time.